Okay, hello everyone. So, as Monty Python used to say, and now for something completely different. And we're going to leave Jerusalem for half an hour and go to elsewhere, to generally nicer places on the human rights front. So this session is, on one level, a continuation of our discussion on Wednesday and Thursday last week at the conference in Mount Scopus, when we discussed transitional justice and human rights beyond the state, and partly on the issues from the city's level, from the city's perspective, how these issues, both abuses and struggles, take place in the city as a site, as a space for human rights violations and human rights campaigns. And it's also part of I think a general outlook. In the conference we had a session on Northern Ireland and the Israeli-Palestinian context. So generally I think it's part of the outlook whoever the we is, or I and some of my colleagues, would like to encourage about sometimes the need to zoom out from the local context, be it Jerusalem or Israel, Palestine, and learn from other cases around the world. And some of these places are nicer than here, some of them are worse than here. Most of them are nice and worse at the same time in different contexts. And I think it's very important because one of the things that conflicts do is they breed insularity. We think our place is the most important, the most complex, unparalleled, and so on. And I think it's interesting to open our mind and to learn from other cases. It's never about copy and paste formulas. It's about inspiration. It's about hearing other examples and learning and taking whatever we can from them. As long as it encourages thinking, I think we've done something. So my friend and colleague, Professor Paul Grady, is the director of the Center for Applied Human Rights at York University in Yorkshire, England. He's also the UNESCO chair holds the UNESCO chair, I think is the technical term, in human rights there, and co-editor of the Journal of Human Rights Practice. He published widely many books and articles, which I will not repeat here, but I think with the main thread of an interest in civil society and in the role of civil society organizations, and he's done lots of work in South Africa and also with our neighbors in Egypt and Tunisia for many years. I was trying to think what is similar between York and Jerusalem, and actually there's quite a lot. It's both very ancient cities with old cities surrounded by walls, with religious institution in the middle. Both of them were occupied by the Romans. I think the Emperor Adrianus is associated with both places in many ways. Both of them were invaded. I mean, York was invaded by the Romans, the Vikings, the Normans, the English, as was Jerusalem. As we'll see on other fronts, it's not exactly the same. So, please, Paul.
Thank you, Ron, both for the introduction and for the invitation, and thanks to Danny and the Minerva Centre as well for inviting me to take part in this event. It's my first time in Jerusalem, and so I'm learning a lot. And this morning's discussions took me back actually to very early stages in my career when I was in South Africa during the apartheid period, but towards the end of it, so what we would probably now call pre-transition. We didn't call it that then, but and the discussions there, I attended a lot of workshops and conferences about the future, and in a very difficult kind of present context at that stage, and for obvious reasons, a lot of that discussion focused on property, land, space, segregation, and so on. So there were real echoes from this morning with that past experience for me. As Ron said, I've been asked not to talk about that, and not even to talk about transitional justice, actually, but to talk about something else, the work we've done on York as a human rights city. So York became a human rights city in 2017 as a result of quite a lengthy civil society-led campaign What I'm going to do is I'll say a little bit about what a human rights city is, because I'm conscious that many of you, it may be a new concept or term. And then if I've got time, I'll detail some of the work that we've been doing in York. I'm conscious that I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch, so I'll also try to be brief and keep to time. So there isn't, in terms of defining a human rights city, there isn't a single model. And there's no sanctioning body. So when York became a human rights city, we self-declared. And we self-declared at a time when we'd had a lengthy campaign, but we felt certain pieces of the jigsaw were in place. So, for example, we had cross-party political support from the right political party, which was quite surprising at that point, through to the one on the left. So it's quite an interesting kind of, I guess, activist or practice space, really, because because it doesn't have a kind of standardization. It's not like national human rights commissions where you have the Paris Principles. There isn't that kind of go-to document. So, but what you have is the emergence of what I've called here a human rights cities movement. So many of the human rights cities are in the global north, but the first one actually was in Rosario in Argentina. It's over a decade after the dictatorship ended in 1997. There's now around 100. People have different, partly because of the ambiguity about what is a human rights city. There are different figures. And there's slightly confusingly named campaign 10, 100, 1,000, which is actually aiming for 100,000 human rights cities by 2030, and being led by United Cities and local governments, which is a kind of networked organization. So there's numbers, there's a kind of exponential rise in the number of human rights cities around the world. Linked to that, there's a growth of networks that are linking these cities together. Some of them are global networks, like the one in Gwangju in South Korea, where there's an annual event for human rights cities to attend. Some of them are national or regional, so the example I've given you here is the US Network Human Rights Cities Alliance. And there's the gradual emergence of kind of normative frameworks. I've listed here the European Charter for Safeguarding Human Rights Cities. There's a Gwangju Declaration. The EU Fundamental Rights Agency is doing some work trying to establish some benchmarks, if you like, for what you should do in order to qualify as a human rights city. So in terms of numbers, the networks and norms, you can see there's something happening here. There's something growing. There's the development of what you could see becoming quite an important part of the human rights movement and human rights infrastructure. Human rights cities is different, and I should just say this quickly at the beginning, from the right to the city. Obviously there are links, but the right to the city is a more political agenda in places like Latin America. So let me move on to say why cities, why human rights? I guess within York, thinking about human rights and thinking historically about human rights has helped us tell a story about the city. So quite a lot of what we did was look historically at York and what had happened to York. And obviously you have, it's a partial story. In every city there's going to be things that are don't lead in some seamless way to becoming a human rights city. But there was a lot historically in the city that we could draw on to say, this is a logical thing for us to do. This kind of makes sense for us to become a human rights city. And to try and get the local government and others to kind of embrace that as part of the story we want to tell about ourselves going forward. It's also been helpful for cities, including ours, to link globally at a time when working nationally is difficult. So making submissions to the UN Special Rapporteur or to other parts of the UN human rights machinery is now something that cities can do directly or in alliance with one another, sometimes separate from states. Why cities? Obviously the growing importance of urban politics as drivers of change, so global cities, but even a small city like York is very keen on being an international city, or having an international presence, as selling itself as having a kind of international reach. The next point is that, human rights has focused for understandable reasons on states, on national governments, and done a lot of work at the international level. It's really underutilized local government. It's a really underdeveloped area within human rights. And so that, I think, is something that is now slowly being rectified. Also, cities can have political identities that are quite different from the national political picture. So, in York, the local government has been always slightly more progressive over the last decade than the national government. And so the national context of a right-wing government, very hostile to human rights, a press that's hostile to human rights, talk of repealing our main piece of national legislation, the Human Rights Act. We quite deliberately positioned the city as in opposition to that, as an act of resistance, really, to say, actually, this isn't what we stand for, this isn't what we want to be doing. And I guess one of the things that I would also, the context here is so different, but that kind of act of resistance from the local to the national could be something that civil society leads. We did that for a period of 6 or 7 years, and it's helpful, obviously, to get local government on board. But if that's not possible, it might be something that a civil society network could do anyway. Cities are important in terms of implementation, particularly around socioeconomic rights. And I mean, in the UK, a lot of work around education, healthcare, housing, and so on is informed by local government policies. And I think cities have, partly because of a lack of standardization, have become a site of considerable innovation in terms of the sorts of work that people have been doing with human rights. And I'll come on to say a bit more about York in a minute. So if you look at, there are some standard features for human rights cities. So there's some kind of commitment to human rights standards or principles. So a lot of human rights cities have a declaration of some kind, a broad statement, uplifting, sometimes with exclamation marks, trying to set out a broad commitment to human rights. But there are also some more specific commitments that cities have made. So some cities have adopted international treaties and looked to implement those treaties within the city space. And sometimes that is an act of resistance. So a number of US cities have adopted CEDAW to try and inform their work on challenging discrimination against women in a country that hasn't formally ratified it, as a very deliberate political stance, saying this isn't what we stand for as a city. Most cities have a structure, so a kind of institutionalization of that commitment. A human rights office, a human rights board, a coalition, and York, we've had a human rights and equalities board for a number of years. And there are the obvious questions there around how is it composed, what are its powers, what kind of resources does it have, and so on. Some cities also have an anti-discrimination office or an ombudsperson, and they vary. Some of them predominantly collect data on discrimination within the city. Others have a complaints handling facility as well. And I guess underpinning all of this, and this is a challenge we faced in York, is where are the teeth? So one of the things we're trying to introduce for our Human Rights and Equalities Board is the capacity for it to, like a National Human Rights Commission can do, is to issue a finding of non-compatibility if the government is wanting to pass a policy that we feel is violating human rights. Now they have to consider it, they have to discuss it, and they have to respond. It's not binding, but it's a formal mechanism that is public that would indicate very concretely and specifically where we feel human rights are being violated. Talked a lot this morning about policy making. A number of cities are including human rights in policy making and practice. So in York, we are developing a human rights and equalities impact assessment tool that, when it's in place, will be used from sort of conception right through to evaluation in policy making to try and anticipate human rights and equalities issues, and then hopefully to address them as they go along, but also as a measure of accountability at the end of a policy process. In terms of some of the challenges, I don't know what the situation is here, but in the UK, and I think in many other parts of the world, local government has been gutted of resources over the last decade and more. So there's not a lot of resource. Powers have often been taken away from local government. So one of the challenges you have is, what actually can local government do there's no point criticising local government for things that it can't change, because it's a national government responsibility. Some human rights cities, in fact the majority, are, the initiative is led by the local authority, so it still is a little bit of a top-down initiative. Ours is unusual in the sense that it was civil society led, and that relationship between the civil society network and the local government is always going to be, as it is in all human rights work, a challenging one. And then the final one is, I mean personally, because we've done something that I think is quite distinctive in York, I'm quite sceptical about initiatives to standardise human rights cities. So the European Foundation is currently trying to get a whole lot of human rights cities in Europe to measure the same indicators basically annually, so that there's some kind of comparison. And we're being a bit standoffish about that for reasons that I'd probably come on to say something about later. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? Okay. So I'll skip that slide and come on to this. So,
skip the chocolate bit.
Yeah, I did, sorry. So in terms of the kind of approach that we've taken to human rights, I mean the heading there is, some of you I'm sure will be aware of the literature on localization, so this idea that you take international law, national law, and you translate it down into local contexts. And we used quite a different approach, which I've called here localism, and it's summarized by someone called Forrestal very neatly in a quote where she says, bringing human rights to people, which is vernacularization translation, is different from taking lived experience to human rights. And that's what we've tried to do. So we published an annual indicator report on human rights in the city, and it's not a hugely complex technical document. We decided we would measure 5 rights, and we asked we did a survey of citizens in the city, residents in the city, asking what their priority rights were, and they came back with 5 socioeconomic, largely socioeconomic rights: education, decent standard of living, housing, and so on. And so we then, under these rights, selected a limited number of indicators. So for non-discrimination, equality, we measure hate crime in the city. And each year we publish a relatively short, sort of 30-page document about the city. And I guess the question for you then is that a meaningful exercise? Would that be a meaningful exercise here in any city, to take the city as your unit of analysis in human rights terms, look at a range of different rights? And one of the things that we found is that councillors have lots of data. What they don't have, but it's often quite specialist and issue specific. What they don't have is something that brings these rights together and creates a kind of narrative about what's happening in the city. So it's become a kind of living document. I wouldn't pretend that everyone has it on their coffee table in the city, but councillors use it, and if only to criticise it sometimes, and it's widely used in civil society. I guess the other thing I would flag here is, and this resonates with the presentations that were made this morning, is we also have, in a very, very different context, the challenge of, do you work with government? How do you work with them? Do you work within the rules as they stand to try and advance rights, even when you maybe don't like them particularly? And we recently got our fingers burnt on a particular issue, which I probably don't have time to explain, but which involved us stepping back for a while from working with the council, even in a place like York, because it was discrediting the network, the civil society networks, and the Human Rights and Equalities Board is now being completely revamped as a result of that. It's been redesigned because it had several design flaws that were illustrated by this particular issue. So I've said already, in terms of the actors, we have a civil society network, which our centre, along with a kind of umbrella organisation for voluntary groups, leads. And then we have the Human Rights and Equalities Board. And then we have a range of activities. So the indicator report, which we publish annually, which the centre authors, is, I guess, the main document we use in the city. We've done work on rights respecting schools, and we're currently discussing whether as a city we want to adopt the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and what that would mean, what value that adds at a city level. We have a Community Voices project. I was interested listening to discussions this morning about co-production and participation in planning recognition, these kinds of things. And there's a lot of consultation in York, but it's very formulaic. And this project attempts to work with marginalised communities to set their own agendas and take them to the council on their own terms, rather than responding to calls for consultation. And then we do a host of events and outreach initiatives like film festivals and so on. I think I'm going to stop there.
All right. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much. I am personally interested in this project. I would like to know if there's anything happening in Israel about human rights cities, so let me know. I live in a very small town in the Negev Desert, Yerucham, 12,000 people, originally no immigrants who were dumped there in the middle of the night within the project of Judaizing the Negev, of course, in the 1950s and 60s. And we do a lot of work. There's a group of activists, some of us, who work in something we call regional texture. That was the term that we invented to talk about how we work with the Bedouins, our neighbors. It was an unrecognized village. Okay, that's a whole story. What is an unrecognized village? Bedouins next to us, and we are working with them, and we actually got the city leadership of the last 10, 20 years to actually work according to our guidelines in encouraging that community to grow. Anyway, and this is the whole issue of LGTB, how do you say that? Education and the refusal to have the voices of left-wing politics suppressed in a town which mostly votes right-wing. And anyway, so I would be very much interested in doing such work in a small town which fights for its rights for vis-a-vis the central government of the country, and at the same time should be responsible for what goes on in its own jurisdiction, vis-a-vis, they can't just say, it's not, we are helpless because it's the central government. They cannot say that. We won't allow it. So, I don't know, any advice?
We'll take maybe another question so we can take them together. If not, I'll ask. I'll ask.
Thank you. This was really fascinating, and I spoke last week about very similar issues. I'm really interested in the kind of potential of urban municipalities in being agents in need of transitional justice, but also actors that can promote it. And I wanted to ask if perhaps after hearing the previous talks as well, you could reflect a little bit more about what you think this kind of process could entail in a more conflicted and divided situation, if you have any thoughts. And then sort of adding on from the previous questions around, a lot of the criticism that is voiced around such initiatives is that they maybe undermine regional solidarity, they create a network of more privileged cities, this talk about how Londoners go to Paris more than they maybe visit Manchester, stuff like that. So I'm just wondering if you create alliances with maybe more conflicted, divided cities to exchange knowledge, but also more peripheral cities in the UK, not just around the globe.
I have a couple of questions. I think there is this. Nothing. This one. So a couple of questions. One, can we talk about the submission to the United Nations Special Rapporteurs? Because that was new to me. Is this in any way recognized, or is it one of the many shadow reports you can do? But I think it's a cool idea. I was not aware of it. The Minerva Center is involved for many years in kind of orchestrating and advising shadow reports to the UN system, so it will be interesting. And my other question, so my assumption, which obviously was partly wrong, is that the human rights city is a kind of It's a bit like the fair trade label. It's kind of labeling you get if your city has no more human rights violations, and then you get the badge and you're very proud. But you also talk about it as a form of resistance. And I was wondering if, I know there's no standardization, but is it about saying we recognize human rights standards and we will fight for them while the situation here is still very bad? Or is it about saying we have no more human rights violations? Because I think, I mean, for example, if, just throwing it out there, but if Walaje, of which we heard in the morning, kind of declared itself to be a human rights village or human rights neighborhood, enclave, the human rights enclave, in order to get the access into the international network, in order to shame, kind of name and shame the local, the central city hall. I mean, could that make sense in any way? Saying, I mean, we are under oppression, but we want to recognize the validity of human rights standards, so we want to be part of this game in order to, as kind of an additional form of resistance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean.
Okay. Thank you. I think I'll fold the advice question into the one about human rights in conflicted settings. I mean, there is a real danger that this becomes a kind of an enclave of the elite. You know, if you look at where most human rights cities are, tells you enough. There's lots in Sweden, so that'll tell you all you need to know. And yes, so we have tried, and actually we're going to, at the beginning of next year, try and organise a kind of national. There is now one other human rights city in the UK, in Swansea, which is Wales, so, which is a very different kind of city to York. So, and we will consciously reach out to neighbours like Hull and Leeds, which are again very different cities to York. So, in conflicted settings, I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't know of any that have declared as human rights cities in those settings. But you know, not to say you couldn't do it. And my advice about how you, I think the advice is, I mean, we made it up as we went along, frankly, but it would be is to start small and to start doing something. So something like gathering data on human rights in the enclave or city, thinking about publishing an annual report is a start on which you can then build in other ways. Establishing the network is the other thing that we have to do there. We needed both a strong civil society network and then wider support from political parties, faith groups, businesses, you know, all of that kind of thing. It takes a while to kind of build, but you need to start somewhere. And some of that's about where your skill set is, frankly, as well. And then try and get some momentum with that. I'm trying to remember now, racking my brains about I mean, there's been a number of occasions where individually collected human rights cities have submitted stuff to the UN human rights machinery. Our specific one I can particularly remember for us was around when Philip Alston came to the UK as a special rapporteur on the right to extreme poverty. And we weren't the only, there were other cities that hadn't formally declared as human rights cities that also submitted stuff. So that's the more concrete example. Yeah, I mean, the kind of, what does the term mean? I mean, we wrestled for ages about whether we should declare a human rights city, when do you do it? And in the end, the advice from others, including people elsewhere in the UK, was just do it. Because if you do it, we've got a reference point then to try and do something similar in our cities. And you could wait for, so it doesn't mean there are no human rights violations because if you're waiting for that, you're going to wait forever. Our declaration, which is on our really bad website, is it's a declaration of intent. That's how it's framed. So we feel that there was a shared intent at the time of the declaration from political parties, etc., to kind of advance human rights within the city. So, and when things happen in the city, I mean, the fact that it's a human rights city is entered public discourse. So when things happen that people don't like, they'll say, well, how can we do this as a human rights city, which is good. They could also say, oh, we should withdraw this label. We can't call ourselves a human rights city. So that's good in the sense that it's part of the public discourse, but And you know, and we have to say, look, we knew that things like this would happen. You know, what we have to gauge is, if there's no longer the intent, then we perhaps shouldn't be a human rights city, or kind of a shared intent. So that, yeah, I mean, that's kind of how we phrase it. So it is, to some extent, international law standards. It's also kind of a broader thing around principles and values. So it's, one of the things we discovered very early on is knowledge of international human rights law, even national human rights law, is virtually zero amongst local government and similarly to civil society. And so, yeah, there was a big job to do there. Was there anything else? I mean, the enclave thing, yes. I mean, I don't see any reason why it's a sufficiently fluid thing that parts of the city, you know, couldn't do something if, you know, if it's feasible. I don't know if in this particular example it's feasible, but and I don't know what the implications would be. Would there be a negative backlash from the government to something like that? You know, the context is everything, isn't it? But in principle, I don't see any reason.
Okay, we'll start working on it after lunch.
Yeah.